Hello there. My name's Ilara, and welcome to the Late Night Science Channel. Tonight, we're going to explore something that might sound strange at first, something that sits at the edge of what we think we know about the living world around us. It's a question that, once you hear it, you might not be able to stop thinking about. Can trees, can they actually feel pain? Not in the way we do, maybe, but something we've been missing all this time, hidden in bark and root and leaf. So if you're the kind of person who finds comfort in these late night wonders, who likes drifting off while learning something new, something that makes you see the world a little differently, then you're exactly where you need to be. And hey, if this sounds like your kind of thing, maybe tap that like button, let the algorithm know you're here, and subscribe so we can keep exploring together, one quiet night at a time. Now, let's begin. We walk through forests all the time, don't we? We lean against tree trunks, we carve initials into bark, we snap branches for kindling or trim limbs for a better view. And we do it without a second thought, because, well, trees don't scream. They don't flinch. They don't run away. But what if that silence doesn't mean what we think it means? What if, in that stillness, something else is happening? Something we've just never learned to hear. For most of human history, we've divided the living world into two categories: things that feel and things that don't. Animals, we said, they feel, they suffer, they react, they matter in a way that demands our attention. But plants? Plants were different, simple, passive, more like furniture than beings. We could use them, shape them, destroy them, and there was no moral weight to it because they didn't feel anything, right? But here's the thing. Science, real science, the kind that asks uncomfortable questions and follows the data wherever it leads, science is starting to suggest we might have been wrong. Not entirely wrong, but wrong enough that it changes things. Trees, it turns out, are far more aware than we ever imagined. They sense their surroundings in ways that are, honestly, kind of eerie when you really think about it. They respond to damage, they communicate distress, and in some cases, they even seem to remember. So tonight, we're going to take our time with this. We're going to move slowly, gently, through the science of trees and sensation, through pain and perception, through all the strange and beautiful ways that life might experience the world without a brain, without nerves, without anything we'd recognize as consciousness. And if you feel yourself drifting as we go, that's okay. That's exactly what this is for. Let the words wash over you. Let your mind wander through forests and roots and the quiet hum of living things. There's no rush. We've got all night. Now, can trees feel pain? Let's start with what we know. Pain, in the way we understand it, is complicated. It's not just damage to tissue, it's an experience, a feeling. When you touch a hot stove, nerves in your hand send signals racing up to your brain, and your brain interprets those signals as pain. That interpretation, that subjective experience, that's what makes it hurt. Without a brain to process the signal, without consciousness to experience it, there's no pain. There's just stimulus and response. This is important because it's the first thing scientists will tell you when you ask if trees can feel pain. Trees don't have brains. They don't have a central nervous system. They don't have anything remotely like the neural architecture that would be required to generate the kind of experience we call pain. So, case closed, right? Trees don't feel pain because they can't feel anything. Except that's not quite where the story ends. Because trees don't have brains, But they do have something. Something that, when you look closely enough, starts to resemble a kind of awareness. Not consciousness, maybe, but something adjacent to it. Something that makes the question more complicated than a simple yes or no. Trees, you see, are constantly monitoring their environment. They're sensing light, temperature, humidity, the chemistry of the soil, the presence of other organisms. And they're not just passively absorbing this information, they're responding to it actively, strategically, in ways that suggest, well, that they're not quite as simple as we thought. When a tree is damaged, when a branch is broken or bark is stripped away, the tree knows. It detects the injury through a cascade of chemical and electrical signals that spread through its tissues. Within minutes, sometimes within seconds, the tree begins to respond. It seals off the wound, it redirects resources, it alters its chemistry to protect itself from infection or further attack. This isn't a reflex in the way we usually mean it. It's not like pulling your hand away from a flame. It's slower, more deliberate, more considered. The tree is, in a very real sense, assessing the damage and deciding what to do about it. And here's where it gets interesting, because these responses aren't uniform. They're context-dependent. A tree that's been attacked by insects will respond differently than a tree that's been damaged by wind. A tree that's experienced drought will prioritize differently than one that's been flooded. The tree is, in some way, interpreting the nature of the threat and tailoring its response accordingly. That's not pain, not in the way we experience it, but it's something that deserves a closer look. Let's talk about what happens when a tree is wounded. Imagine a gear strips bark from a young oak. The moment that bark tears away, exposing the soft cambium underneath, something remarkable begins. The cells around the wound start producing chemicals, defensive compounds, designed to protect against infection. Phenols, terpenes, resins. These aren't random byproducts. They're targeted responses, activated specifically because the tree has been damaged. But how does the rest of the tree know what's happened? How does a root at the base of the trunk or a branch high in the canopy learn that there's been an injury halfway up the trunk? The answer is signals. Chemical signals and electrical signals that travel through the tree's vascular system, through the phloem and xylem, spreading information about the damage. These signals move slowly, far slower than nerve impulses in animals, but they move with purpose. And when they arrive at distant parts of the tree, those parts respond. They begin producing defensive chemicals too, even though they haven't been touched. It's a kind of early warning system, a way for the tree to prepare for further attack before it happens. Some researchers have measured these signals directly. They've attached electrodes to tree trunks and recorded electrical activity, spikes and waves that correspond to injuries or environmental stresses. The patterns aren't random. They're specific, reproducible, and they correlate with observable changes in the tree's behavior and chemistry.
In some experiments, when a caterpillar begins chewing on a leaf, the tree's electrical activity changes within seconds, and not just near the leaf being eaten, but throughout the entire plant. It's as if the tree is aware, as if it knows something is wrong and is mobilizing a response. Now, does this mean the tree feels pain? No, not in the conscious suffering sense, but it does mean the tree is responding to damage in a way that's sophisticated, adaptive, and frankly, a little unsettling when you really think about it. Because if a tree can detect injury, communicate that injury to the rest of its body, and mount a coordinated defensive response, what else might it be capable of? There's a tree in Germany, an old beech tree, that became famous in scientific circles a few years ago. Not because of its size or age, but because of what researchers discovered when they started monitoring it closely. This tree, like all trees, was connected underground to other trees through a network of roots and fungi. These fungal networks, called mycorrhizal networks, link trees together, allowing them to share resources, water, nutrients, even information. It's a kind of internet, if you will. A wood wide web, some scientists call it, only half joking. But this particular beech tree was doing something unexpected. When researchers wounded it, when they deliberately damaged its bark, the tree didn't just respond locally. It sent signals through the mycorrhizal network to neighboring trees. And those neighboring trees that hadn't been touched, began ramping up their own defensive chemistry. They were being warned, prepared, as if the wounded tree was saying, "Look, something bad is happening here. You might want to get ready." This kind of communication has been documented in forests all over the world. In some cases, when one tree is attacked by insects, nearby trees of the same species begin producing insect deterrent compounds before the insects even arrive. They're responding not to the insects themselves, but to chemical signals released by the tree under attack. It's called induced resistance, and it's been studied extensively in plants. But in trees, where individuals can live for centuries and where communities are deeply interconnected, it takes on a different character. It's not just individual plants defending themselves, it's cooperation, collective defense, a kind of social behavior that we don't usually associate with organisms that can't move or see or think. And this raises a question that the more you sit with it, the more complicated it becomes. If trees can communicate distress, if they can warn each other of danger, if they can alter their behavior based on signals from injured neighbors, what does that mean for how we think about their inner lives? Do they suffer? Do they experience anything like fear or distress? Or are these just mechanical responses, complex but ultimately empty of feeling? The honest answer is, we don't know. We can't know. Not in the way we can know what another human is feeling. But the science is forcing us to at least ask the question. Let's slow down for a moment. Let your breath settle. Let your body sink a little deeper into wherever you're resting. We're going to drift now into the underground, into the hidden world beneath the forest floor, where roots tangle and thread through soil and stone, where fungi weave between them, where the real conversation is happening. You see, when we look at a forest, we see trees, individuals, separate beings standing apart from one another. But below ground, the picture is different. Roots from different trees interlace, sometimes even graft together, fusing into a single continuous system. And wrapped around and through those roots are fungal hyphae, thread-thin filaments that connect tree to tree, sometimes across vast distances. These fungi, mycorrhizal fungi, form partnerships with trees. The tree provides the fungus with sugars, carbon captured from the air through photosynthesis, and in return, the fungus provides the tree with nutrients pulled from the soil, phosphorus, nitrogen, minerals that would otherwise be inaccessible. But the relationship goes deeper than just nutrient exchange. These networks also carry signals, chemical messages. Information about what's happening in one part of the forest can quite literally flow through the soil to other parts. When a tree is stressed, when it's attacked or injured or suffering from drought, It releases certain compounds into this network. And other trees, receiving those compounds, respond. They adjust their own physiology, their own chemistry, in anticipation of similar stress. It's not altruism, exactly. It's more like shared vulnerability, a recognition that what happens to one tree might soon happen to another. And that preparation, collective preparation, increases everyone's chances of survival. In some forests, researchers have found that older, larger trees, what they sometimes call mother trees, seem to play a central role in these networks. They're more heavily connected than younger trees. They share more resources, and in some cases, they seem to preferentially support their own offspring, seedlings that grew from their own seeds, over unrelated youngsters. This isn't conscious favoritism, of course. It's likely driven by chemical recognition, the ability of a tree to detect genetic similarity through root exudates or fungal signals. But the effect is the same. The forest, it turns out, is not just a collection of individuals competing for light and water. It's a community, a network, a system where the success of one depends, at least in part, on the success of others. And within that system, damage to one tree reverberates outward, affecting not just that tree, but the entire community. So when we ask whether trees feel pain, we're not just asking about individual sensation. We're asking about connection, about whether harm to one part of the network constitutes harm to the whole. And that's a much harder question to answer. Now, let's talk about memory, because this is where things get really strange. Memory, we usually think, requires a brain. It requires some kind of stable storage system where experiences can be encoded and later retrieved. In animals, that's the hippocampus, the cortex, networks of neurons that change their connections based on what happens to us. But trees? Trees don't have any of that. And yet, there's growing evidence that they remember. Not in the way you remember your childhood or what you had for breakfast, but in a functional sense. A tree that has experienced drought may alter its physiology in lasting ways that persist even after water returns. Its stomata, the tiny pores on its leaves that control gas exchange, may open less readily. Its roots may grow deeper, prioritizing water access over other resources. This isn't just damage, it's adaptation based on experience. The tree's body has encoded the memory of stress, and that memory shapes future behavior. In some experiments, researchers have subjected young trees to mild stress, repeated episodes of drought or herbivore attack, and then monitored them over time. These stressed trees, even years later, show different response patterns than trees that were never stressed. They're primed, sensitized, as if they remember what happened and are ready for it to happen again. This kind of memory is called somatic memory, memory stored in the body rather than in a brain. And it's not unique to trees. Even simple organisms, bacteria, fungi, can exhibit forms of memory, altering their future behavior based on past experiences. But in trees, where lifespans can stretch across centuries, where an individual might survive countless droughts, storms, fires, and infestations, this kind of memory takes on a different significance. The tree's entire structure, the thickness of its bark, the depth of its roots, the chemistry of its leaves, becomes a living record of what it has endured. And here's the unsettling part. If a tree can remember damage, if it can carry the experience of pain, if that's what we want to call it, forward in time, does that memory matter?
These aren't scientific questions anymore. They're philosophical ones, but the science is what's forcing us to ask them. Let your mind rest for a moment. Let it drift back to the surface, to leaves rustling in wind, to sunlight filtering through canopy. We're going to shift now. Shift from roots and memory to something even subtler. Something about the way trees sense the world. Because sensation, it turns out, is everywhere in a tree. Every leaf, every root tip, every patch of bark is constantly sampling its environment, detecting light, temperature, chemicals, touch, sound. Yes, sound. There have been studies, strange and wonderful studies, where researchers played recordings near tree roots, recordings of water flowing through pipes, and the roots grew toward the sound, not toward the pipe itself, but toward the sound, as if they could hear it. Now, trees don't have ears. They don't have any auditory apparatus at all, but they do have mechanoreceptors, cells that respond to vibration, to pressure waves moving through soil and air. And some of these receptors, it seems, are sensitive enough to detect the faint sounds of water trickling underground. This isn't hearing in any conventional sense, but it is acoustic sensitivity. The tree is using sound, or something like sound, as a cue to guide its growth. And touch. Trees are exquisitely sensitive to touch. When wind bends a sapling, when an animal brushes against bark, the tree responds. It alters its growth, producing more support tissue, strengthening the areas that experience the most mechanical stress. This process, called thigmomorphogenesis, is how trees adapt to their environments, how they become wind resistant or learn to support heavy branches. But it's also a kind of responsiveness, a sensitivity to the physical world that's far more nuanced than we usually credit. In one famous experiment, researchers gently stroked the stems of young plants every day, just a light touch, nothing damaging. And over time, those plants grew shorter, sturdier, with thicker stems and more compact forms. The touch itself was a signal, and the plant responded by changing how it grew. So trees feel, in the tactile sense. They detect pressure, vibration, mechanical strain, and they respond, not randomly, but in ways that are adaptive, that improve their chances of survival. But does that constitute pain? Or is it just information processing? Stimulus and response without the subjective experience that makes pain painful? That's the question that haunts this entire discussion, because we can measure the signals, we can document the responses, but we can't access the interior experience, if there even is one. And maybe that's okay. Maybe the point isn't to definitively answer whether trees feel pain. Maybe the point is to recognize that our lack of an answer doesn't mean there's nothing there. It just means we're asking questions about forms of life so different from our own that our usual frameworks don't quite fit. Here's something else to think about. When a tree is attacked by insects, it doesn't just produce defensive chemicals. It produces specific defensive chemicals, tailored to the specific insect doing the attacking. A caterpillar chewing on leaves triggers one suite of compounds. A beetle boring into bark triggers another. The tree can tell the difference. It can distinguish between types of damage, between mechanical injury and biological attack, between one species of herbivore and another. How? Through chemistry. When an insect bites into plant tissue, it leaves behind saliva, enzymes, compounds that are unique to that insect. The tree detects those compounds and uses them to identify the threat. Then it activates the appropriate defensive genes, producing toxins or deterrents that are most effective against that particular attacker. In some cases, the tree even produces volatile chemicals that attract the insect's natural predators. It's calling for help, essentially, releasing a scent that says, "Hey, there's a caterpillar here. Come eat it." This is called indirect defense, and it's been documented in countless plant species. But think about what it implies. The tree is not just reacting to damage, it's interpreting the nature of the damage, classifying it, and selecting a response from a repertoire of options. That's sophisticated. More sophisticated than we give most non-animals credit for. And it raises the question again, if a tree can distinguish between different kinds of harm, if it can tailor its response to the specific nature of the threat, does that suggest some kind of experiential dimension to the damage? Not pain, maybe, but awareness? Concern? Some kind of internal representation of what's happening to it? We don't have words for this. Our language, our concepts are built around animal experience, human experience. We don't have a vocabulary for describing what it might be like to be a tree, detecting a threat, mobilizing a defense, existing in a slow, chemical, rooted awareness of the world. But just because we don't have the words doesn't mean it's not there. Let's drift deeper now into the chemistry of it all. Because really, that's where this whole question lives, not in nerves or brains, but in molecules, in cascades of hormones and signaling compounds that flow through a tree's tissues like thoughts through a mind. When a tree is wounded, one of the first things that happens is a surge of jasmonic acid. This is a hormone, a chemical messenger that tells the rest of the tree something's wrong. It activates defense genes. It triggers the production of protective compounds. It prepares the tree for further attack. Jasmonic acid is, in a sense, the tree's version of an alarm signal. And it spreads quickly, relatively speaking, through the tree's vascular system, reaching distant branches and roots within hours. But here's the interesting part. The intensity of the jasmonic acid response depends on the severity of the damage. A small wound triggers a small response. A large wound triggers a large one. The tree is, in effect, measuring the extent of the injury and scaling its defense accordingly. That's not a binary on-off response. It's graded, proportional, calibrated. And that suggests something more than a simple reflex. It suggests judgment, assessment. The tree is, in some biochemical sense, evaluating how bad things are and responding appropriately. Other hormones play roles too. Salicylic acid, for instance, is involved in defense against pathogens. Ethylene, a gas produced by stressed tissues, can trigger early leaf drop or fruit ripening. Abscisic acid signals drought stress, prompting the tree to close its stomata and conserve water. Each of these chemicals carries information, and the tree integrates them, weighing multiple inputs, multiple threats, and producing a coordinated response that balances competing needs. It's a kind of distributed intelligence, intelligence without a brain, where the tree's entire body participates in sensing, processing, and responding to the world. And the more we learn about these systems, the harder it becomes to dismiss them as purely mechanical. because they're not mechanical, not in the way a thermostat or a reflex arc is mechanical. They're adaptive, context dependent, history dependent. They learn, they remember, they change. So maybe the question isn't whether trees feel pain. Maybe the question is whether our definition of pain is too narrow, whether we've been looking for animal-like experiences in non-animal organisms and missing something equally important, something different but no less real. There's a concept in philosophy of mind called phenomenal consciousness. It's the idea of what it's like to be something, what it's like to be you, experiencing the world from your perspective. The redness of red, the taste of chocolate, the ache of a sore muscle. That's phenomenal consciousness, the subjective quality of experience. And for most of human history, we've assumed that only animals have it. Maybe only mammals, maybe only primates, maybe, some would argue, only humans. But what if we're wrong? What if phenomenal consciousness isn't binary, something you either have or don't have, but a spectrum, a continuum, where different organisms experience the world in different ways, to different degrees, through different modalities? In that framework, a tree might have something. Not consciousness like ours, not even consciousness like a dog's or a fish's, but something. Some minimal form of experiential awareness. A dim, slow, chemical sense of its own existence and the things that threaten it. We don't have ways to prove this, of course. We can't ask a tree what it's like to be a tree. We can't measure subjective experience with instruments. But we can observe behavior, and we can notice when that behavior starts to look less like mechanism and more like, well, like something we'd recognize as intelligence if we saw it in an animal. And trees, increasingly, are showing us that kind of behavior. They solve problems, they adapt to novel situations, they communicate, they cooperate, they remember, they even, in some sense, learn. So maybe they feel. Not pain exactly, but something. Some tree-specific version of distress or damage awareness that matters to them, even if it doesn't look like anything we'd recognize. And if that's true, if there's even a chance it's true, doesn't that change how we ought to treat them? We need paper. We need the resources trees provide. And trees, unlike animals, don't have a centralized nervous system, don't have the neural architecture for suffering in the way animals do. But maybe it means we should use them thoughtfully, with awareness, with recognition that we're interacting with living beings that are far more complex, far more responsive than we once believed.
There are traditions, indigenous traditions around the world that have always understood this, that have always treated trees with respect, with reverence even. Not because they believed trees were conscious in a human sense, but because they recognized that all living things have a kind of dignity, a kind of presence that deserves acknowledgement. Modern science, in its slow, empirical way, might be catching up to something those traditions have always known. That the line between feeling and non-feeling, between awareness and non-awareness is blurrier than we thought. That life, in all its forms, participates in something larger than mechanism. Something that, even if it doesn't rise to the level of consciousness, still matters. Let your thoughts slow now. Let them settle like leaves falling softly to forest floor. But before we drift too far, let me tell you about something else. Something that makes this whole question even more interesting. Trees, you see, don't just respond to their own damage. They respond to the damage of others. When one tree is wounded, when it releases those chemical signals into the air or through the soil, neighboring trees pick up on those signals and they respond. They begin producing defensive compounds, even though they haven't been touched yet. It's a form of eavesdropping, really. Trees are listening to each other's chemical distress calls, and they're using that information to prepare themselves for threats that haven't arrived yet. In one study, researchers wounded tomato plants and measured the response of nearby plants. The unwounded plants, just by being near the wounded ones, began producing defensive chemicals. They were responding to volatile compounds released by the damaged plant, compounds that signaled danger. And here's what's really interesting. The response wasn't uniform across all nearby plants. Plants that were genetically related to the wounded plant responded more strongly than unrelated plants. It's as if they could recognize their kin, their relatives, and they cared more about warnings from family than from strangers. This kind of kin recognition has been documented in several plant species. In some cases, plants will even alter their growth patterns depending on whether their neighbors are relatives or not. They'll compete less aggressively with kin, sharing resources more readily, while being more competitive with unrelated neighbors. So, trees aren't just passive recipients of information. They're actively discriminating between different sources of information, weighing the significance of signals based on who's sending them. That's social behavior. That's the kind of thing we associate with animals, with beings that have brains and social structures. But here it is, in organisms rooted in place, communicating through chemistry rather than sound or sight. And the communication doesn't stop there. Some trees can even distinguish between threats based on the time of day. Their defensive responses vary depending on whether damage occurs during the day or at night. During the day, when photosynthesis is happening and the tree has abundant energy, defensive responses might be more immediate and more intense. At night, when energy is limited, the response might be more measured, more conservative. This suggests that trees have an internal sense of time, a circadian rhythm that influences how they respond to threats. And circadian rhythms, these internal clocks, are one of the hallmarks of sophisticated biological systems. They allow organisms to anticipate changes in their environment, to prepare for dawn before the sun rises, to gear up for night before darkness falls. Trees have these rhythms. Their leaves open and close their stomata on a daily schedule. Their sap flow varies with the time of day. Even their gene expression patterns follow circadian cycles. So, When a tree is damaged, its response isn't just determined by the nature of the damage, it's also influenced by when the damage occurs, by the tree's internal state, by its assessment of available resources. The tree is integrating multiple streams of information: time of day, type of threat, severity of damage, proximity of other threats, and producing a response that's tailored to all of those factors. That's computational. That's information processing. And it's happening in an organism without a brain, without a nervous system, without any of the hardware we usually associate with that kind of sophistication. Let me tell you about a particular kind of tree, the acacia tree that grows in the African savanna. These trees are constantly under attack from herbivores, especially giraffes, which love to eat their leaves. But the acacia has developed a remarkable defense system. When a giraffe starts eating its leaves, the tree doesn't just produce defensive chemicals in the leaves being eaten. It produces them throughout its entire canopy. And not only that, it releases a volatile chemical into the air, a warning signal that drifts downwind to other acacia trees. Those downwind trees receiving the signal begin producing their own defensive chemicals before the giraffe even reaches them. They're preparing for an attack that hasn't happened yet, based entirely on a chemical message from a neighbor. Giraffes, it turns out, have learned about this system. When they're feeding on acacias, they often move upwind, away from the direction of the warning signals. They've learned that trees downwind have been warned and will be less palatable. It's an arms race, a co-evolutionary dance between trees and herbivores, playing out over millions of years. And what's fascinating is that the acacias don't warn every tree equally. Trees that are closer to the one being eaten respond more strongly than trees that are farther away. The signal degrades with distance, and trees seem to calibrate their response based on how strong the signal is, how close they think the threat might be. That's proportional response. That's risk assessment. That's the tree making a calculation about how much to invest in defense based on the probability of attack.
Now, think about what all of this means. Trees are detecting damage to themselves and to others. They're distinguishing between different types of damage, between different sources of threat. They're communicating with neighbors, warning them of danger. They're adjusting their responses based on time of day, based on their internal state, based on the proximity and identity of other trees. They're remembering past stresses and using those memories to shape future responses. They're making resource allocation decisions, balancing the costs of defense against the costs of growth and reproduction. All of this sophisticated, adaptive, context-dependent behavior is happening without a brain, without neurons, without consciousness, at least as we understand it. So what do we make of this? What do we call it? Is it intelligence? Is it awareness? Is it feeling? The traditional definitions don't quite fit, but maybe that's because the definitions are wrong. Maybe intelligence, awareness, even feeling are broader categories than we thought. Maybe they exist on spectrums, taking different forms in different organisms, adapted to different ways of life. A brain is one way to process information. to respond adaptively to a complex environment. But it's not the only way. Trees have evolved a different strategy, one that's distributed rather than centralized, chemical rather than electrical, slow rather than fast. But in its own way, it's just as sophisticated, just as adaptive, just as, well, just as intelligent. Let's drift now. Let's slow down even more. Your breathing is probably getting deeper now. Your thoughts may be starting to blur at the edges. That's good. That's what we want. So let me tell you about something gentler, something quieter. Let me tell you about how trees care for their young. Because, yes, in a sense, they do. When a mother tree, a large, established tree, produces seeds that germinate nearby, something interesting happens. Those seedlings, those young trees that share the genetic lineage of the mother, receive preferential treatment through the mycorrhizal network. The mother tree, connected to the seedlings through fungal threads, transfers sugars to them, extra carbon, energy, nutrients. She's supporting them, giving them a better chance to survive in the dark understory, where light is scarce and resources are limited. This isn't random. Seedlings that aren't related to the mother tree don't receive the same level of support. The mother tree somehow can distinguish her own offspring from unrelated seedlings, and she chooses to invest more in her own. This is called maternal investment in animals. It's one of the foundations of evolutionary biology, the idea that parents, especially mothers, invest resources in their offspring to increase those offspring's chances of survival. And here it is, in trees. Organisms without brains, without emotions, without conscious knowledge of their offspring's existence. And yet, the behavior is there. The investment is real. The effect is the same as if the mother tree knew and cared about her children. How does she recognize them? Probably through chemical signals, through the composition of root exudates or fungal markers that vary with genetic relatedness. The mechanism is chemical, not conscious. But the outcome, the pattern of behavior, is strikingly similar to what we see in animals. And it raises the question again. If a tree can recognize its offspring and prioritize their survival, if it can make resource allocation decisions that favor its own genetic legacy, does that suggest some kind of internal valuation system? Some way of assessing what matters and what doesn't? In a forest, right now, this is happening. Mother trees are supporting their young. Wounded trees are warning their neighbors. Roots are exploring soil, making decisions about where to grow and where to retreat. Chemical signals are flowing through fungal networks, carrying information about drought, about insect attacks, about the state of the forest. And all of this is happening slowly, quietly, beneath our notice. We walk through forests and we see stillness, but beneath that stillness is a world of communication, of cooperation and competition, of sensing and responding and adapting. It's a world that operates on a different timescale than ours, but it's no less active, no less dynamic. And the more we learn about it, the more we realize that our old categories, living and non-living, conscious and unconscious, feeling and unfeeling, don't capture the reality of what's happening. Trees exist in a gray area. They're alive, clearly. They respond to their environment, clearly. They exhibit adaptive behavior, clearly. But do they feel? do they suffer? Do they have any kind of subjective experience? We don't know. And maybe we can't know. But the fact that the question is even worth asking, the fact that the science has brought us to a place where we have to seriously consider the possibility that trees might have some form of awareness, that's remarkable. It's a reminder that the living world is stranger, more complex, more interconnected than we ever imagined. And it's a reminder that intelligence, awareness, feeling, these things that we thought were uniquely animal, uniquely brain-based, might actually be much more widespread. They might exist in forms we've never recognized, in organisms we've never thought to look closely at. So let's come back to the original question. Can trees feel pain? The scientific answer is probably no, not pain in the way we experience it. Pain, as we know it, requires a nervous system, requires a brain to interpret signals as suffering. Trees don't have that. But can trees detect damage? Yes. Can they respond to it in sophisticated, adaptive ways? Yes. Can they communicate about it, warn others, remember it, adjust future behavior based on past experiences? Also, yes. So maybe the question isn't really about pain. Maybe it's about awareness, about whether there's something it's like to be a tree, even if that something is completely alien to our own experience. And that's a question that science alone might never be able to answer. Because subjective experience, if it exists in trees, isn't something we can measure directly. We can only observe behavior, infer function, and wonder. Let your mind wander now, deeper into the forest. Imagine yourself among the trees, your hand resting against rough bark, feeling the texture, the warmth or coolness of it. Beneath that bark, just beneath your palm, there are cells, living cells carrying out their work. They're monitoring their environment, detecting light levels, temperature changes, chemical gradients. They're communicating with neighboring cells, passing signals along, coordinating responses. And beneath your feet, hidden in darkness, roots are spreading. They're exploring, searching for water and nutrients. When they encounter an obstacle, a rock or a dense patch of soil, they don't just stop. They probe, they test, they find a way around. They're problem-solving in their own slow, patient way. And as they grow, they're leaving chemical traces, markers that other roots can detect. Roots from the same tree avoid each other generally to maximize the area they can explore. But when roots from different trees meet, something more complex happens. Sometimes they compete, one root system trying to outgrow the other, claiming territory. But sometimes, especially if the trees are related, they coexist more peacefully. They might even share resources through grafted connections or through fungal intermediaries. It's a negotiated space where different individuals with different needs and different capabilities find ways to share a limited resource. That negotiation, that balance between competition and cooperation, that's sophisticated social behavior. And it's happening in the dark, slowly, chemically, without any of the drama or speed of animal interactions. But it's real. There was a study done years ago, a study that's still debated in scientific circles, where researchers played classical music to plants, and some of the plants seemed to grow better, seem to respond to the music. Now, most scientists are skeptical of this. Music is complex, and it's hard to imagine what mechanism a plant could use to benefit from it. But sound in general, that's different. Sound is just vibration, pressure waves moving through air or soil, and we know plants can detect vibration. So maybe it's not the music itself. Maybe it's the vibrations, the physical disturbance in the air that the plant is responding to. Maybe those vibrations, at certain frequencies, stimulate growth or trigger beneficial stress responses. Or maybe it's all just noise, statistical artifacts and confirmation bias. The science isn't settled, but what is clear is that plants are far more sensitive to their physical environment than we once thought. They can detect touch, pressure, vibration, changes in gravity, magnetic fields, electrical fields. They're constantly sampling the world around them through multiple channels. And all of that information, all of those signals, are integrated somehow. The plant doesn't just respond to light, or just respond to water, or just respond to touch. It responds to all of them simultaneously, weighing them against each other, producing behaviors that represent some kind of optimization of competing demands. That integration, that balancing act, that's computation, information processing. And it suggests that somewhere in the plant's tissues, in the patterns of hormone flow and electrical activity and gene expression, there's something like a model of the world, a representation, however crude, of what's out there and what it means for the plant's survival. Now, let's talk about something that might surprise you. Pain, or at least the detection of damage and the behavioral changes that follow, might actually serve a purpose in plants that's similar to its purpose in animals. In animals, pain is a teaching signal. It's evolution's way of saying, "Don't do that again." When you touch something hot and it hurts, you learn to avoid hot things. The pain creates a memory, an association between a stimulus and a negative outcome, and that association shapes your future behavior. In plants, something similar might be happening. When a plant is damaged, it doesn't just respond in the moment, it changes. It becomes more sensitive to similar threats. It primes its defenses. And in some cases, those changes persist, creating a kind of learned avoidance. The plant doesn't avoid in the sense of moving away, but it avoids in the sense of being better prepared, less vulnerable, more resistant the next time. That functional equivalence, that's what makes the question of plant pain so tricky. Because even if there's no subjective experience, even if the tree doesn't suffer in any way we'd recognize, the function of the system is the same. Damage detection leads to behavioral change, leads to increased survival. And in evolutionary terms, function is what matters. Whether there's consciousness behind it or not might be irrelevant, at least from the tree's perspective. But from our perspective, from an ethical perspective, it matters. Because we care about suffering. We care about consciousness. We don't want to cause pain to beings that can experience it. And so we're left with this uncomfortable uncertainty. We know trees respond to damage in complex ways. We know they exhibit behaviors that in animals we'd associate with awareness and even distress. but we don't know if there's anyone home. We don't know if the lights are on inside. Let me tell you about one more thing, and then we'll start winding down, letting all of this settle into the quiet spaces of your mind. There's a phenomenon called crown shyness. In some forests, when you look up at the canopy, you'll notice that the crowns of trees don't touch each other. There are gaps, small channels of sky visible between the branches of neighboring trees. These gaps form a kind of puzzle pattern, fitting together but never quite overlapping. For a long time, scientists weren't sure why this happened, but now we think it's a form of self-regulation, a way for trees to avoid damaging each other as they sway in the wind. When branches rub together, they can cause wounds, create entry points for disease. So trees, somehow, sense when they're getting too close to a neighbor, and they stop growing in that direction. They maintain a polite distance, a buffer zone that protects both individuals. How do they know? Probably through touch, through the mechanical stimulation of branches brushing against each other, or maybe through light, through the detection of shade patterns that indicate a neighbor's presence. Whatever the mechanism, the result is a kind of mutual respect, a spacing that benefits everyone. And when you see it from below, looking up through those gaps, it's beautiful. It's like the trees are holding space for each other, acknowledging each other's presence and right to exist. Crown shyness isn't universal. Not all species do it. But in the forests where it occurs, it creates these remarkable patterns, these visible reminders that trees are not isolated individuals. They're part of a community, and their growth, their very shape, is influenced by the presence of others. It's another form of tree sociality, another way that these organisms, rooted and still, nevertheless interact, communicate, and shape each other's lives. So here we are, at the end of this long, slow journey through forests and roots, through chemistry and electricity, through questions that don't have easy answers. Can trees feel pain? Maybe not. Probably not, if we're strict about our definitions. But can they sense damage? Yes. Can they respond in sophisticated, adaptive ways? Yes. Can they communicate, cooperate, remember, learn? In their own way, yes. And maybe that's enough. Maybe we don't need to prove that trees have subjective experiences to recognize that they deserve our respect. Maybe the complexity of their responses, the sophistication of their behaviors, the depth of their interconnections, maybe all of that is reason enough to treat them with care, not because they're like us, but because they're remarkable in their own right, because they represent a different kind of intelligence, a different way of being alive in the world. There's a growing movement in environmental ethics, a movement that argues for extending moral consideration beyond animals, beyond creatures with nervous systems, to all living things. Not because plants can suffer in the way animals can, but because they have their own forms of flourishing, their own ways of thriving or failing, their own good that can be promoted or harmed. And recognizing that, taking it seriously, might change how we interact with the natural world. It doesn't mean we can't use trees. We're part of nature too, and we need resources to survive. But it might mean we use them more thoughtfully. We harvest sustainably. We recognize that a forest is not just a collection of timber, but a living community with its own integrity, its own value beyond what it can provide to us. We take only what we need, and we give back when we can. We plant, we restore, we protect. Your eyes are probably heavy now, your breath slow and steady. Let yourself drift with these thoughts. Let them blend into dreams. Imagine a forest at night, moonlight filtering through leaves, casting shadows on the forest floor. The trees stand silent, but beneath that silence, there's activity. Roots exploring, fungi threading between them, chemical signals flowing like whispered conversations in the dark. In that forest, a tree has been wounded. Maybe a branch broke in a storm, or maybe an animal stripped some bark. The tree detects the damage, sends signals through its tissues, begins producing protective chemicals, and through the mycorrhizal network, through the wood wide web, information flows to neighboring trees. They respond, preparing their own defenses, sharing resources if needed. It's a community taking care of itself, not through conscious choice, but through evolved mechanisms that promote collective survival. And in its own way, it's beautiful. It's a reminder that life finds ways to persist, to adapt, to thrive, even in forms we don't fully understand, even in ways that don't require brains or eyes or movement. Life is patient. Life is creative. Life is everywhere, in every form, constantly solving problems, constantly responding to challenges. And trees, ancient and wise in their own way, are among the most successful problem solvers the Earth has ever produced. They've been here far longer than we have. They've survived ice ages and meteor impacts, droughts and floods, diseases and disasters we can barely imagine. And they've done it by being, in their slow, patient way, aware, responsive, connected. So maybe they don't feel pain, but maybe they don't need to deserve our wonder, to deserve our respect, to deserve a place in our moral universe that recognizes them as more than resources, more than scenery, more than the backdrop to our own dramas. They're beings in their own right, different from us, but no less real, no less alive, no less worthy of consideration. As you drift now, as sleep begins to claim you, let your last waking thoughts rest on this. Tomorrow, when you walk outside, when you pass a tree or see a forest in the distance, you'll see it a little differently. You'll know that beneath the bark, behind the stillness, there's activity. There's sensing and responding. There's communication and memory. There's a kind of life that's been here all along that we're only now beginning to understand. And maybe, just maybe, you'll feel a little more connected, a little more part of the web of life that includes not just humans and animals, but plants and fungi, bacteria and soil, all of it interconnected, all of it participating in something larger than any individual part. We're all in this together, sharing this planet, sharing resources, sharing space. And the more we understand about the other forms of life around us, the better we can be as members of this community. The trees are listening. They've always been listening to the wind, to the rain, to each other. And now slowly, we're learning to listen back, to pay attention, to notice, to wonder. And in that wondering, in that attention, we find something valuable, something that makes us more fully human, more fully alive, the capacity to recognize life in all its forms, to respect it, to marvel at it, to protect it. So sleep now. Sleep peacefully, knowing that the trees stand watch in the night, that roots spread beneath you, that leaves whisper overhead in forests near and far. They've been here for hundreds of millions of years, and if we're lucky, if we're careful, they'll be here for millions more, silent witnesses to the passage of time, to the rise and fall of species, to the endless dance of life on Earth. And in the morning, when you wake, the trees will still be there, still sensing, still responding, still participating in their slow, patient, chemical way in the great conversation of life. And you will be a little more aware of it, a little more attuned to the quiet voices speaking in bark and root and leaf. Sweet dreams. May your sleep be deep and your rest complete. And if tonight's journey has opened your eyes to something new, if you'd like to keep exploring these mysteries with me, there are more stories waiting for you. Just click that video right there, and I'll meet you in another corner of the natural world where more wonders wait to be discovered. Until then, rest well. The forest is watching over you. Good night.